All right, this is for Brad Morgan, and ultimately looking at this, the first thing I would say right off the bat is that you've got a good texture set going on. You've got a good, everything looks well and concise and working well together as far as colors and things like that. But ultimately, you want to ask yourself, what's your focal point? Looking at this, we've got the sword, the rock, and then this big leaning tree, and everything's kind of leaning together on it. And so ultimately, what you're kind of running into is, I just don't know where to look. And the reason being is because the tree is, or the sword is kind of working me up here into the rock, and I look at the rock and look at the design, and then the tree kind of pulls me off the page. And so you need to kind of really think about your overall process of what you want to kind of really achieve. In this case, what is your, what do you want the viewer to really pay attention to? I look at this and I see a ton of different shapes, a ton of different options, but ultimately you want to ask yourself, what is my main focal point? And so if your main focal point is the rock, then you need to silhouette the rock out. If your main focal point is the sword, you need to push other things back so that it makes much more sense. The sword itself, I look at and I could, it looks awkward because it looks like a 2D image that you tried to skew, and you're not really putting it in perspective. And to put it in perspective, you want to go right up there. You want to angle things accordingly so that this would have a little bit more thickness, and it leads into this, and then this has more shape, which again leads into. So looking at this, you want this kind of beak to have more shape and more form. Think of it as like a square box, and accordingly. But if that's the case, if you just want, if you want to have some sort of kind of idea or kind of force that keeps us looking at what we want to look at. And so ultimately, I think it boils into kind of a compositional thing where you want to adjust and move these things accordingly. Having the rock lean up against the tree basically creates, it's fighting with the rock, so we don't separate that out. So if I were to go back and grab some of these colors, and I'm just going to ultimately kind of paint out go back to pen pressure here, and ultimately if we paint out that tree, that rock now becomes much more kind of a form factor, what we're looking for. And we can still have trees in the background and things like that, to basically give us the outskirts of what we want to kind of achieve. But ultimately, it really boils down to, even simply taking this out here and now putting this back in. So I'm going to kind of block out this sword like so. And I'm really, really roughly painting this out here. But you can see by blocking out that sword, we now have a kind of emphasis of what we wanted to achieve. And if that makes sense, that's ultimately where you're looking at. Now, if that's the case, if you want us to focus on this rock, then what I would tell you to do is ultimately build in more. And what I mean by that is you can do a ton of extra things in here to really kind of sell this idea. And what I would tell you to do is, if you get rid of this tree in here and then we go through this kind of focal point and add in, you know, a little bit of brush, a little bit of, you know, your painted information like so. And let's kind of just work this in like so. So now the rock becomes the focal point, and you can see here that it becomes much more interesting. And then you could even do something a little bit more interesting, and in this case what I would tell you to do is, let's add in we're just going to add in this kind of design here, and I'm just kind of roughing out that idea. And so now the sword is a little bit more defined element in there, okay? And so you can still have that sword in there, and you could even go through, and I'm just going to I'm even going to go in here and we're going to just do a layer copy real quick. And if you want that sword in there, you know, now you can basically have that as your secondary focal. So your shape reads better, and then everything else kind of reads accordingly. And so it could be like, you know, kind of sword in the stone, but it's just on a different kind of platform. And then what I would do is I would add in the additional growth here. And I know I'm changing the overall concept of your idea, but you can see by doing this, I'm already starting to kind of really build up and kind of really kind of push the idea of, you know, what this could be. And so you can see here, I went from a confusing layout to now here, I have, you know, a more refined element. And it's much more interesting this way, I think, personally, because I see the elements of themselves kind of really kind of selling a lot better. And so, you know, that is, I think, what you want to kind of achieve is, you know, your focus is the sword and the stone, not the big tree in the background. You know, and by getting rid of that tree, our focus now becomes much more kind of unified. And then by getting rid of by integrating the sword with the stone, it becomes more unified. And so if that makes sense. So I hope this helps you out. And if you have any questions, feel free to ask.